Every morning in the village began the same way. Fishermen headed out to sea before dawn, when the sky was just beginning to lighten and the horizon remained grey and flat. On this day, everything seemed familiar. Two men, a father and an adult son, were preparing their motorboat for departure. They checked the nets, the fuel, the navigation. Neighbors saw them on the pier, calm, collected, without unnecessary words. For them, it was a routine trip, a few hours at sea, returning for lunch, the catch to be divided up at the market. The boat was old but well maintained. Its hull glowed blue in the morning light. The engines spooled smoothly. Everything on board was in order: fish boxes, a water canister, a first aid kit, and flashlights. The men knew the sea, its shifts and caprices. They weren't newbies, and they didn't take unnecessary risks, so no one doubted they would return, as always. Life in the village went on as usual. Women went to the store, children got ready for school, and only empty crates and the smell of salt water remained on the pier. Time passed, the sun rose higher, and the boat didn't return. At first no one was alarmed. The fishermen might linger if the catch was rich. But by evening, the anxiety became palpable. There was no boat or lights on the horizon. The next day, the Coast Guard raised the alarm. Search boats went out to sea. They combed the waters, checked coordinates, and contacted other vessels. But the sea was empty. No debris, no nets, no traces of the accident, just a flat surface, leaving no clues. The fishermen's personal belongings were where they belonged: a jacket on a hook, a knife on a shelf, a mug on the table, but there were no people. This discovery began a story that quickly spread beyond the village. Coast Guard reports read, "Boat found at pier, no signs of wreck, crew missing." These dry lines didn't convey what the families were feeling. For them, this was more than just a disappearance. It was a disruption to the familiar order in which the sea always returned those who knew its rules. Neighbors gathered at the pier, discussing what had happened. Some said the men might have fallen overboard. Others said someone had found and returned the boat, and that the fishermen had been lost in a storm. But there were no storms. The weather was clear, the wind light. The theory after theory crumbled, leaving only emptiness. The family's house was quiet that evening. Unused plates sat on the table. The jacket the son always took to sea hung in the corner. The phone was silent. Every ring, every knock on the door felt like a glimmer of hope, but it only brought the words, "The search continues." On the fourth day, the boat was inspected again, this time more thoroughly. Experts checked the hull, engine, and navigation. Everything was working properly, but in the cabin, they found something that shouldn't have been there. A leather-bound book lay on the table. It was old, worn, with yellowed pages. No one in the family knew about it, and none of the fishermen had brought it. The book looked as if it had been recently read. Several pages were dog-eared, and pencil marks clung to the margins. They underlined lines about the sea, lights over the water, voices in the fog, a place where the sea never returns. These words sounded like a warning, but who left them in the boat and why remained a mystery. There was no title on the cover, only an embossed symbol resembling a circle with lines extending inward. The symbol was unfamiliar to both the investigators and the locals. The book seemed alien, out of place and time. The discovery was recorded in a report. The entry read, "Item discovered, leather-bound book, condition, satisfactory, origin, unknown." But the dry lines couldn't hide the anxiety. The book was becoming evidence that disproved the accident theory. Rumors began circulating in the village. Some said the book belonged to an old fisherman who had died at sea. Others said it had been planted there deliberately to confuse the investigation. Still others whispered that the book had returned on its own, just like the boat. The family didn't know what to think. The book was foreign to them, but it now connected the disappearance to something bigger than just the sea. Thus began a new story, a story in which the sea ceased to be just water and wind. It became a space where disappearances were not explained by storms or chance. And the first clue in this story was a book lying on a table in the empty boat that returned empty. When the boat returned empty-handed, the village did what it always does. It went ashore and waited. In the morning, there were conversations on the pier. By midday, lists of those ready to go to sea. By evening, silence by the window. This is what always happens when one's own disappear. First they talk, then they act, then they listen to the water. And the water, as usual, says nothing. The Coast Guard quickly organized the operation. The boats departed along their usual route, northeast, toward the shallows, then straight toward the line of rocky breakers, beyond which the sea became deeper and darker. Divers descended at the entrance to the bay. The water gauges showed a slight list, but there were no storms. The weather couldn't explain the empty boat. The reports were calm. No technical faults detected, no signs of a struggle found, personal belongings in place. These statements grew harsher with each passing day. They were as smooth as lines on a map, and that made them even colder. The family read them, unable to understand how anyone could describe an absence so carefully. They sat shoulder to shoulder on the pier, barely speaking. The eldest brother occasionally glanced at the horizon, as if trying to find the exact spot where it all happened. But on the water, nothing changed. The light, the gentle breeze, the occasional bird. Volunteers combed the shoreline, looking for signs of landfall, debris, scraps of nets, anything they could cling to as evidence. They found only the bow of an old crate, a washed-out nail, and a mark on a rock left 3 years earlier by local boys. Everything foreign and irrelevant. In the evening, they picked up flashlights. The light fell on the pebbles and cut through the water at the edge. The flashlights, too, revealed nothing. By the evening of the second day, the first discrepancy appeared in the reports. A witness from a neighboring village claimed to have seen their boat later than recorded in the log. The times were off by half an hour. Half an hour isn't much, but it easily accommodates the round-trip crossing, the maneuver around the rocky ridge, and the conversation on the water. The investigator listened, wrote down, and left a comment. Check. They checked. It wasn't confirmed. On the pier, this episode was discussed at length, as if those 30 minutes could provide the answer that 3 whole days hadn't. The divers descended into the depths. Below, a smooth layer of sand and occasional patches of mud. No nets, no ropes, no clothing. The boat, returning to the pier, maintained a strange decorum. The engine was clean, the mooring lines were tied properly, the lights were off, the charts were unmarked. It felt as if the voyage had been interrupted, not out of panic, but in order, and this order seemed alien. People don't disappear like that, not so neatly. The village revived old stories about lights over the water that their forefathers had seen, about voices in the fog that call if you set out too early, about the traverse of the northern pine forest where even the most experienced try not to linger. These are usually stories for winter evenings when there's a kettle, old photographs, and time to drag out. This time they sounded different. Not like legends, but like an attempt to define boundaries on a sea where there are no boundaries. The young people listened silently. Those who had laughed before were not going out on the water these days. The book lay in the cabin like a strange object, difficult to ignore, and even more difficult to explain. It hadn't been taken from home, found on the pier, or brought in by neighbors. It simply ended up where it shouldn't have been. On the third day, the investigator came back on board and checked the pages again. In the margins were fresh notes near the phrases, "a place where the sea doesn't return," and "voices follow the water's edge," as if on a rope. The notes were made in soft graphite with an uncertain hand, as if the reader was in a hurry and afraid to forget. Traces of salt remained on the folds of the pages, not from the sea air, but as if the book had been held with wet fingers. This fact was not included in the report, too subtle a detail, too subjective, but it remained in the memories of those who saw it. By the evening of the third day, the village had changed. There was less chatter on the pier. People went to the store less often. The fish didn't emerge from the sea in the usual quantities, not because there were fewer of them, but because there were fewer boats. People now saw the water not as a resource, but as a space from which someone had never returned. This difference is small, but it changes hands, gazes, and the speed of steps toward the pier.
A few seconds of white noise.
And that was it. The interruption didn't contradict anything and didn't explain anything. They recorded it like they record a current, observed. It entered the protocol as a statistic and into the conversation as a sign.
On shore, someone said,
"In this place." Another said, "It happens." A third, "Nothing." The family learned to live with the sound of a radio and an empty boat at the pier these days. In the morning, questions for the security guard.
During the day,
Brief conversations with neighbors who came with groceries and left with the words, "Hold on." In the evening, the light in the kitchen, left on even when no one was sitting at the table.
a map of the bay hung on the wall.
A standard tourist one, with marked trails up the cliffs and viewpoints. A pencil cross had been drawn on it, the place where people usually turned back. This cross meant nothing to the sea, but it was essential for the house.
It made it easier to look out toward the water.
The news kept coming. The search continues. No new information. The book has been handed over for study. One evening, an old man who rarely spoke but was always watching entered the house. He didn't sit down, didn't console anyone, only said, "These pages were turned on the water," and then he left. The phrase hung like wet clothes near the stove. No one discussed it out loud, but it gradually soaked into the walls.
When the first week ended,
The wording "crew missing in action" appeared in the reports. It was expected, but that didn't make it any less devastating. The villagers had learned to pronounce it without pausing. Words always take practice. In the second week, they checked the northern ridge again. On the third day of the second week, the western drop-off. Everywhere, silence and a flat bottom. Nothing they could pick up and say, "There." The boat lay at the pier, an empty shell, devoid of purpose. The engine hadn't been started, the net hadn't been touched. A book lay in the cabin, now on the table at headquarters. They leafed through it, not as an explanation, but as a tangible fact. There it was, with its corners, its notes, its symbol on the cover. Its weight was real, a little heavier than you'd expect from old paper. People occasionally peered into headquarters just to look, not at the text, but at the object itself, and then they left in silence. In the evenings, the sea was smooth, a thin line of light on the horizon, smooth planks on the pier. Everyone's footsteps on them sounded the same. The light in the windows grew softer, conversations shorter. These days, nothing suggested a solution.
they were looking not for a conclusion,
But for a point of support. And for now, the only point, besides the empty boat, was the book, which disrupted everything with its presence. It didn't explain the disappearance, but it fixed it with the reality of the object. In documentary history, this is a rare thing, when a clue, not providing a theory, yet still finding its center. The search didn't stop. New squares appeared on the map, new faces on the pier, new pauses at the family's door. The sea was silent, as steadily as on the first day. The silence here is not a sign, not a message, not a threat. It is a state in which everyone does their own thing. Some go into the water, some remain on the shore, some open a book to the page that says there is a place where the sea does not return. When the search began to wind down and the phrase "missing in action" began appearing in every report, a book lay on the desk at headquarters. It was the only object that didn't fit into the usual order. The boat could have returned on its own. The motor was running, the current was helping, but the book couldn't have appeared by chance. Its cover was dark, the leather cracked at the edges, and on the spine was an embossed symbol resembling a circle with radiating lines. There was no title. The pages were yellowed, but the text remained legible. These weren't fictional stories, but notes collected at the beginning of the last century. Someone had recorded fishermen's stories, rumors, observations. Everything related specifically to this stretch of sea. The recordings recurred with the same themes. Lights over the water, voices in the fog, a place where the sea never returns. Some spoke of boats that saw a distant light and sailed toward it, but never returned. Others spoke of voices calling their names. Still others spoke of the sea, sometimes taking its course, leaving no bodies or debris behind. There were fresh pencil marks in the margins of the book. The lines that mentioned death and disappearance were underlined. The paper was slightly wrinkled in these areas, as if the pages had been handled recently. The investigator noted this in his notebook, but didn't include it in the report.
It was too difficult to explain who and why had read the book in a boat where it shouldn't have been. The family insisted
That neither father nor son had such a book. They had never seen it in the house. The neighbors also denied it. This became a new mystery for the village. Some said the book was planted to confuse the investigation. Others said it returned on its own, like a boat.
The elders whispered it was a sign.
The sea had left a warning.
The experts said
The paper had recently absorbed moisture.
anyone who held the book
Experienced a strange feeling, as if it were not just an object, but a witness. Not an eyewitness, but a participant. It didn't explain the disappearance, but recorded its presence.
that evening.
When only the duty officers remained at headquarters, the book lay open to the page that read, "The sea takes only those who hear its call." This phrase began to be repeated in conversations. It was quoted in whispers, as if it could explain what the protocols did not.
Meanwhile,
Life in the village slowed. Boats came out less frequently, and fishermen stared at the water longer than usual. An empty boat stood on the pier, and every time people passed by, they glanced in its direction. It was a reminder. The sea had returned the shell, but not the people.
the book became
The center of the story. It didn't provide an answer, but it posed a question, and this question was heavier than the silence of the sea. As the searches became routine and the reports began to repeat themselves, the book gradually came to the fore. It lay on a separate table at headquarters, next to the maps and observation logs. It wasn't hidden, but neither was it touched unless necessary,
Everyone who entered glanced at the cover.
as if checking to see if it was still there.
The investigator in charge of the case
Tried several times to explain its origin. The first theory was that one of the fishermen had taken the book with them, but the family denied it. It wasn't in the house, nor was it in the village library. The second theory was that the book had been planted, but the boat returned on its own, and no one saw anyone boarding it. The third theory was a memory error. Maybe it was there, but they forgot. But the book was too prominent to be forgotten.
Meanwhile,
The text within began to work on its own. Notes from the early 20th century described incidents that oddly paralleled the present. Boats returning empty, fishermen hearing voices, lights that led into the depths and then disappeared.
these coincidences weren't proof.
But they shattered the peace.
Experts said
The pencil is soft, the marks are fresh, no more than a few weeks old. This meant the book had been read very recently.
people in the village began to talk about it out loud.
Some called it a sea diary, others a warning. The elders recalled that similar notes had once circulated in manuscript form, but no one had seen them for decades,
Now the book lay here.
and its pages seemed to confirm what was happening before their eyes.
Officials
Tried to keep things within bounds. Their reports included dry lines like, "Object discovered, origin being determined." But in private conversations, even they acknowledged that the book was the only piece of evidence that somehow connected the disappearance to anything concrete.
The family came to headquarters
And asked to see it. They turned the pages carefully, as if afraid of damaging it. The mother's gaze lingered on one spread. It read that the sea takes only those who hear its call. She closed the book and never opened it again.
Rumors in the village multiplied.
Some said the book belonged to fishermen who had disappeared many years ago. Others said it reappeared every time the sea claimed people. No one could prove any of these theories, but its very materiality gave the rumors credibility. By the end of the second week, the book had ceased to be just a find. It had become a symbol that the disappearance was not a coincidence, a symbol that the sea maintains its own rules that diverge from those of humans.
At headquarters,
They left it open to the same page, where it said, "The place where the sea doesn't return." This phrase became the end of each day. People went home, the lights were turned out, but the book remained open. Thus, the investigation entered a new phase. Now it was no longer just a matter of searching for bodies or traces. Now it was a matter of the book changing the very logic of the case. It didn't provide an answer, but it shattered all previous theories.
And from that moment on,
The disappearance ceased to be a waterborne tragedy. It became a mystery in which the clue wasn't a net, a motor, or a map, but a book found where it shouldn't have been.
when the search finally concluded,
Silence fell over the village. It wasn't like ordinary evenings by the sea, when the sound of the waves mingles with voices and the creaking of planks on the pier. This was a different kind of silence, heavy, as if the water itself had ceased to reflect sound.
the boat was still moored at the dock.
No one had touched it. No one had boarded it. No one had started the engine. It had become something of a monument, an empty shell that had returned without those who should have been inside. People passed by and turned away.
Even children stopped playing nearby.
The boat frightened them more than the adults' stories.
The book lay at headquarters.
Its pages were turned less and less frequently. At first, they looked for coincidences, then for explanations, then simply held it in their hands to make sure it was real. But the longer it remained, the stronger the feeling grew that the book offered no answers.
It merely recorded
An absence.
life in the village began to change.
Fishermen went out to sea less frequently, and when they did, it was no further than the line where the shore was still visible. The word accident no longer rang in conversation.
It was replaced by others.
Place, sign, call. No one said it outright, but everyone understood. The disappearance had become part of something greater than just the sea and the boat.
The family lived in anticipation.
They received no bodies or belongings, except for that book that didn't belong to them. The house remained full of objects, but empty of sounds. In the evening, the lights in the windows burned longer than usual, as if that could hold back time.
The official reports concluded with the formula,
The case is suspended. The crew is listed as missing in action. A dry line that should have concluded the matter, but it didn't. But, in the village, they knew the story wasn't over. It simply remained without a sequel.
sometimes at night,
People would see lights on the horizon. They would appear suddenly, last for a few minutes, and then disappear. Some said they were ships passing by. Others said they were the very lights written about in the book. No one checked. No one wanted to.
the final gesture was closing the book.
And putting it away in a drawer, not as evidence, but as an object that had lain in plain sight for too long. Its weight remained in memories, its words in conversations.
But now it was hidden.
As one hides something that neither the investigation nor the sea can explain. And the sea became smooth again. It roared as always, but everyone who looked at it saw more than just water. They saw the emptiness left behind by those who had left and never returned.
The story ended.
Not with a conclusion, but with an absence. The boat was moored at the pier. The book lay in its drawer. The sea roared. And all of this together suggested one thing. Sometimes disappearance isn't an end, but a form of presence.